This is the Old West Element 2 Part 3 about the Homestead Act and populating the West. Now the Homestead Act of 1862, remember that date and add it to your timeline please, said that someone could acquire 160 acres by living on it for 5 years, improving on it, and paying $30. 500,000 families took advantage of this to find their American dream in the West. However, 2.5 million had actually purchased land, which was often barren and hard to live on. 66% of homesteaders eventually gave up and went home. Those who stayed were known as Sod-Busters, who busted up the topsoil that had been frozen and baked over centuries on the top layer, usually about 6 inches thick, to expose the good farming soil that was underneath. The only way to get to the good farming soil was to bust the top layer of sod, and that's why they were known as Sod-Busters. Often using the sod, as you can see in the background here, to build their houses and their roofs. There was very few wood out there, there were very few trees, so Sod-Busters used the old Nebraska marble to build houses, set up barbed wire to build fences, and use corn cobs or manure for fuel. You can see an example of a typical Sod-Buster homestead right here. The sod is stacked up to make the walls. The sod is used as shingles over the wooden roof. The dirt floor on the inside made things pretty dirty with a lot of bugs and a lot of mice. And windmills would have to be put in place to get water because there really was nowhere to get it. These strips of sod, again, were called Nebraska marble, was the nickname for them, and they usually got them from over here, busting the top layer of the sod to get the exposed farmland. Now, because there was so few wood out there, and because there was so little water out there, dry farming was used to a great extent. Dry farming was the farming of crops that didn't require a lot of water, but you were also beating up the soil when you're in these baked areas of the summertime in the Midwest. This powdered the soil, and that would later become an ecological disaster with the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Another problem were land speculators who would take advantage of the Homestead Act with dummy homesteaders. In essence, land speculators are people who invest in risky real estate stocks. They would go out there and they would buy a bunch of land, but remember the conditions of the Homestead Act were that you had to live on it for 5 years and improve it. Well, basically, land speculators just wanted the land so that when the land values went up later, they could sell them for a great profit. So they'd send out a dummy homesteader for about a couple of weeks, maybe a month, to squat on the land and set up a tent. But if you weren't actively improving it, you weren't allowed to hold on to the land. But nobody ever came out to check. So one dummy homesteader went back to the land office and filled out a form that said he had improved the land by putting a 12 by 12 dwelling on it. What the homesteading land office did not check on was the fact that this guy had built a 12-inch by 12-inch domain, a foot by a foot, and put it on the land. This is the kind of stuff that land speculators and dummy homesteaders would get away with as they bought up plots of land out there. So in populating the West, we have the bona fide honest homesteaders that are going out there, and also the land speculators that were taking advantage of the situation. In populating the West, we saw a huge migration surge that took place between the 1870s and the 1890s. This is primarily due to mining, ranching, and the Homestead Act. After the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, Colorado became a state in 1876 and is therefore called the Centennial State, happening or becoming a state a century after we declared independence in 1776. The West would grow very rapidly in terms of statehood from 1889 to 1890 as well. In the span of only 2 years, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming would all become states, followed by Utah in 1896. New Mexico and Arizona, right in here, were just territories at this time and would not become states until 1912. But the only thing that really remained in the eyes of people was the Oklahoma Territory right here. The Oklahoma Territory was the last of the Indian territories, the reservations that Native Americans had been put on as they lost their lands to white settlement. This is, like I said, the last of the Indian territory, but in the eyes of settlers who were looking for more places to go and had already gobbled up everything else, well, this was the only place left to go. And that resulted in the Oklahoma land races, starting the first one in 1889 and continuing into the 1890s. Essentially what happened with an Oklahoma land race is that the government would go out and get a chunk of land in Oklahoma, survey the land, and divide it into 40-acre and 160-acre plots, marking them with flags. Boomers, as they were called, would then race for the land plots and stake their claim by taking out the government's flag and putting their own flag in there. Now, they were called boomers because they took off for their American dream at the boom of a cannon. They literally lined up, and when the cannon went off, they raced for their land. Once they got there, they had to wait for a government surveyor to come around and officially record it, because you didn't dare leave your claim. Somebody would come along and steal your flag and take it out. And if you got there at the same time as somebody else, a lot of times who had the claim or who had rights to the claim was settled by, you guessed it, the old-fashioned law of the gun. Now, those were boomers, but the University of Oklahoma is known as the Oklahoma Sooners. Now, what's a Sooner? Well, a Sooner is someone who would sneak out illegally the night before the race and hide, and then stay in waiting until the race started, and then jump out and stake their claim on the most prime and pristine land plots. Now, of course, they were called Sooners, the cheaters, because they left sooner than everybody else. That was the nickname that was given to them. The first Oklahoma land race brought 50,000 boomers out there to a region of Oklahoma, which was the first chunk of Oklahoma that was given away. And the town of Guthrie, Oklahoma, appeared out of nowhere overnight with 10,000 settlers. The Oklahoma Territory had 60,000 settlers by the end of 1889, and races would continue throughout the 1890s. Oklahoma would eventually become a state in 1907. But already by 1890, the government was announcing that there was no longer a discernible frontier line in America. In other words, there was no way to define what was the frontier and what was not anymore, what was the civilized territory and what was the dangerous territory, because all unsettled areas had been dotted with settlements. So for the first time ever in 1890, according to that census, the government announced that we don't have a frontier anymore. We're now all over the country. However, Americans were moving too fast. By 1900, most of the free land was going or had already gone. Now the purpose was to preserve it. And so, as you can see on the map here, various national parks were being set up. As I mentioned before, the first one being Yellowstone in 1872, followed by Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks in 1890. Those are both things I want you to put on your timeline, along with Yellowstone as well. If you've never been to Sequoia National Park, it's an amazing place. It's the home to the famous sequoia trees, as you can see here next to a gift shop and ranger station. This is not one of my personal pictures, but I've been to this tree right here, the old General Sherman. It's the biggest tree in Sequoia National Park. And if you look up some pictures online of Sequoia National Park, they've actually carved out the trunks of trees over roads or built roads through them. So 2-lane roads can go right through one of these trees. But I digress. The frontier, by the time the frontier line had closed, was more than just a place. It was a state of mind and a symbol of opportunity. Its quote-unquote closing marked the end of a very romantic chapter in American history, where immigrant populations that were clogging cities could go west if they knew how to farm, or even if they didn't, they could learn. If they didn't know how to farm or failed at their dream out there, then they tried it again in Chicago, Denver, or San Francisco, rapidly urbanizing the West as those cities became bigger than some of the cities out east. By 1900, geographically speaking, the U.S. westward expansion had become the stuff of legend. A dream for some, but a nightmare for others. More on that in Element 3. Thanks for listening.